Hi everybody, this is Lynn Serafin from Trentino Genealogy, and today is Philo Friday, today being Friday the 5th of June 2020. And just to remind those of you who may not be familiar with what Philo means, or if you just like to hear me say it again and again every week, Philo is a traditional practice in Trentino where usually between dinner time and bedtime people would get together and tell stories. It was a way of bringing the family close together, transmitting oral history, and just being entertaining in the days before radio and all of that, and television, and certainly before Facebook. So it actually, just to mention again, it comes from the word to spit, and it's because traditionally it was also the time when the women would sit and spin the yarn, spin the threads of the wools or silk or whatever it is that they were spinning. And but I think it's a double meaning, because it also means like to spin a tale. So anyway, here we are, and I started doing the Philo Fridays during the lockdown period. I've been doing them every week except for 1 week when I wasn't feeling too well. And I am going to be from next week, or from after today, I'll be doing them twice a month, because now some of us are starting to go out again, and I also find that it takes a lot of preparation. so I need to do some work on Fridays as well. So I'll be doing them every other week, and I'll let you know more about that later as we go along. Anyway, on to today. Today's topic, as I mentioned, is going to be about illegitimacy. Gosh, I'm going to stumble on that word, I think, as I'm saying it throughout the session. We're going to be looking at what do we know about illegitimacy in Trentino. I'd say before the 20th century, because 20th century things are a little clearer, but before that, how is illegitimacy regarded? How is it recorded in the parish records? And if you have been reading my articles, when I say parish records, it's the reason why I'm mentioning them is that civil records really didn't come onto the scene until much later. So parish records go way back, a lot further than civil records. What does legitimate and illegitimate mean? And can an illegitimate child become legitimate? And how did attitudes change over the years? Now, the other thing I'm going to be looking at is a very interesting place that some of you are familiar with called Santuario, not Santuario, but the Istituto delle Laste. Today it's called the Santuario. And that's a maternity home from the 19th century that I think you'll find very interesting when I talk about that. At the end of the broadcast, I'm going to be showing some examples of things that I found in the records for that institute, as well as examples of illegitimacy in my own trade. So I think you'll find some of those kind of interesting. So just to say that my resources for this, apart from my own research, which has been through not just through parish records, but also through the registers at the Archivio Provinciale, as I'll tell you later in the broadcast. A little bit of the information came from this book. I know I've shown, this is not the Trentino. Now I've shown this book to a few people before, and they were like, is that the book that has all the names of everybody ever born in those years, like it is on the website? No, it's not. This is a book that summarizes the research that was done. So it's like thoughts of looking at patterns of surnames, patterns of population, and it has one really interesting chapter on the institute that I'm going to be talking about, and I'll show you a picture from in there, because it has some pictures of the kids, and it's really heartbreaking. But anyway, so that's the other source. And then also there's another book which I don't have in print, but it's a free PDF available. I'll try to find the link so you can download it yourself. It is written in English, one of the few things out there written in English. Nothing in Trentino is not, it's in Italian. And that's a study, I won't call it a book, but like a 50-page article by a woman named Yolanda Anderley, and it is about the Santuario delle Laste that I'm going to be talking about. So that might be something that some of you might be interested in reading. I'll share the link, if I can find the link to it, with you so you can download it yourself. Okay, so first of all, illegitimacy. It's always been there. Human beings are human beings, and it's basically, what do we know about it? Has it increased? Has it changed over time? My impression is that it probably has always been very similar, but it's more a matter of that we measure it in different ways and we observe it in different ways. As a social issue, illegitimacy was never really addressed by the state, let's say, or until after the Prince Bishop that whole office of Prince Bishop was actually abolished at the time of Napoleon, which was the end of the 1700s, going into the 1800s. Before that, it was kind of there. It was mentioned and nothing really done for the situation having to do with illegitimate children. And this is something that we'll look at in a few minutes. It was really the Habsburgs and actually, ironically, one of the counts of Thun who stepped in and said, no, we actually need to do something about illegitimate children in Trentino. It is a stigma, of course, to do with morality and people judging. I would think that it's usually a judgment on the females, but it does have a stigma on the child growing up, and it also can it can affect heredity. Now, some of you have been commenting in that poll I posted on illegitimate births that you found in your tree. Jean Pancari brought up one that is actually who they are theorizing is the founder of the Pancari, well, he is the founder of the Pancari family, but that he's believed to be the illegitimate son of one of the I forget who you said, one of the great lords of the era. And so, I know that, say, for instance, the Campo family, the very noble Campo family who owned Castello Campo, who had Castel Toblino, they had a Prince Bishop in the family. They were really, really quite formidable. They died out at a certain point in the 1400s, I think, because the last heir to that, legitimate heir to that line, he didn't have any sons who were legitimate. He had an illegitimate son, but, emperor didn't want to pass on that to him, so they seized the lands, they gave it to somebody else, and that's actually how the Von Trapp family, yes, of Sound of Music, that's how they acquired Castello Campo, was from an illegitimate birth in the Campo family, which I find kind of interesting. So anyway, that's a little bit of trivia. So let's look first at well, what does illegitimate mean? Basically, it means a child born out of wedlock. It doesn't actually just mean a child born out of wedlock. It means a child conceived out of wedlock, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So, because a child can be born out of wedlock but still become legitimate, and I'll explain that in a minute. So, how do we recognize it in records? A lot of you, when I took the poll, you said to me that you weren't sure whether or not you have an ancestor who's legitimate or illegitimate. Now, you wouldn't necessarily unless you actually looked at the original records. So if you're just doing it on Nato and Trentino, where there are just names, you're not going to know. Those are just names. It doesn't say whether the child is legitimate or illegitimate. Now, from the 19th century onwards, the books, the parish records, have columns in them. And when a baby is born, or baptized, I should say, there are usually two columns that say legitimate or illegitimate, and it'll have a mark as to which one the child is. Now that makes it easy. You look and you see, is he or she legitimate or not? Before the introduction of that, it was done not quite as in quite the same kind of system, and it was really up to the priest how he wanted to record it. Sometimes it was implied that they were legitimate simply because they weren't mentioned that they were illegitimate. It was as simple as that. It's like you assumed they were all legitimate, even if it didn't say so. So you kind of assumed that. Some priests would get very flowery, and it would say, like, Antonio, the natural and legitimate son, meaning the biological and legitimate son of Antonio and his wife, blah, blah, blah. So that would be very flowery. Other times, it doesn't actually put the emphasis on the child. It'll just say that the wife was legitimate. So like Antonio, son of Giovanni, and his legitimate wife, Maria. Now that implies legitimacy in the child because Maria is his legitimate wife. Now we don't actually know if the child is legitimate because he or she could be the child of somebody else, but at least on paper, the child is legitimate. So those are the kinds of words that you would see. You would see natural and biological, or natural and legitimate rather, or legitimate wife, or absence of any mention at all, or it usually would say legitimate wife. One of the most interesting and sometimes frustrating ways that it's recorded is it will sometimes appear, an illegitimate birth will sometimes appear upside down in a record. So you're looking at the book, so say if you're looking at it on the screen in a digital image, and suddenly you're reading, and all of a sudden the record is upside down. And you go, what the heck is that? It's because that's how a lot of priests recorded illegitimate births. I haven't actually transcribed too many of those. You have to turn the whole thing around on the screen, but that's what you're going to find there. So if you see something written upside down, not necessarily on the side margins, that's different. That's usually somebody just squeezing something in. But if it's deliberately in there, written exactly upside down, so the priest turned the book over and wrote it in there like that, it means the child is illegitimate, or it'll probably say it in the record as well. Now, there's one record that I'm not sure if I want to mention it now. I think I'll mention it later. No, there's one record where it didn't say anything at all about it. And I'm going to tell you that story of that person later. And I found that one was a bit tricky for me. I found out about it much later. So, right, one example. Yes, that's what I was going to say. Okay, so what is the next thing? Yes, can a legitimate child ever become illegitimate? Yes, the rules around it are this. If a child was conceived and then the parents got married, it didn't have to be even right before the child was born, mind you. It could be after the child was born. Usually it was before, but it could be after. That child could be made legitimate after the fact. Okay, I've seen that lots of times. But there were some rules about that. Both parties, both the husband and the wife, or the mother and the father of the child, had to be single and free to marry at the time of conception. Now this varies in other countries. I think in England the law was it had to be at the time of marriage, but in the Catholic Church at that time it was at the time of conception. So if that child was conceived when one of them was still married, and then one of them became a widow or widower, and then they got married, no, then the child cannot become legitimate because one of them was married to somebody else. But if they were both free to marry at the time of conception, or what was deemed to be conception, then that child could be legitimized if the parents married, even if they married sometime after. So that's a very interesting bit of information as well. So, and how they measured conception, well, I guess it was just, I don't know. I don't know how they measured it back then, but a lot of countries would do it through 10 lunar months, which is roughly 9 months of what we do in the West nowadays. Okay, so one thing I want to mention before I move on to the institute that I'm going to talk about is the concept of midwives, because midwives were really important in all of this too. And the history of illegitimacy and the history of midwives, they kind of help, they kind of have parallel stories. They're not the same stories, but they are parallel stories, because the period of time we're going to look at, which is in the middle of the 19th century, was also a period of time where midwives were starting to be recognized as really professionals in the community. And instead of just, old women delivering babies. Midwives, first of all, in the past, as you know, if you've done enough genealogy, infant mortality was really high due to infection, due to poor diet during pregnancy. Infant mortality was rife. It was really, really high. You could churn out 14 kids in 20 years or less than 20 years, and maybe one or two of them survived. That's the way it was. It was really tough life, and women died a lot as a result of either labor or something to do with pregnancy after, childbirth after. So because infant mortality was so high, midwives in the year, 1593, 1593, midwives were then given permission to baptize a child if she deemed the child to be in danger of death. And this is because it was almost blasé that the child would die because there were so many deaths. But what was deemed most important was the salvation of the child's soul. So, and I say that because that's how they perceived it. And so the midwife was allowed to baptize a child in the event that the child was deemed in danger of death before he or she could be brought to the church and be blessed by the priest officially. Now, if the child survived, then they did the formal ceremony with godparents present. If not, then she would do a blessing. She would do a quick baptism, and if the child died, the child died. The child wasn't always given a name at that point, but sometimes yes and sometimes no. But you will see this often in the records where the priest will say, the midwife baptized the child because she thought he was in danger of death. He or she was in danger of death, and now I've done the baptism in the church in the presence of these godparents, blah, 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 like that. So that was in 1593. So midwives were considered very important in terms of ensuring the spiritual safety of the child. But by around the middle of the 18th century, 1743 is a date I saw, and this was under one of the prince bishops who's, I can't remember which one. But by this time, midwives were now thought to be, it was deemed that they needed some consistent training, that they needed to be able to be licensed to practice, so that the babies would have better chance of survival, and the mothers as well. So now, for the first time, we start to see the physical needs of the child concerned. Now, I'm getting to how this relates to illegitimacy, so bear with me for just a minute, because the two, as I say, are parallel streams that kind of merge in the 19th century into something very interesting. So before, around this time, in the mid-18th century, if a midwife in Trentino, from what I've read, I think I actually read it in the Not in Trentino book, this is where I read it. Before then, or around then, women were midwives, prospective midwives, were required to go to Innsbruck or Padova to do their training. That's where the closest schools for midwifery were for them. So they had to go there. But in the 19th century, a new place was built where they were trained, and it was in Trento. And this is what I'll come to in a second. Now, let's get to the 19th century in terms of attitudes and changes in patterns. The 19th century, according to some statistics, say they indicate that there was a rise in illegitimate births. Now, whether this is just that they were more accurately recorded, or the children were starting to survive more because the midwifery was better, or who knows, I don't know why. But if the statistics indicate that there was a rise in illegitimacy. Now, there are many speculations as to why. As I said, some of it may be just that the children were surviving, but some people, some especially upper class people, said, well, no, it's because of increased immorality in the public, and they attributed immorality to being poor. So poor people were immoral. That was kind of the attitude of the upper classes, and it's quite classist, okay? So is poverty to blame for illegitimacy? Well, yes and no. I mean, frankly, there are just as many illegitimate births in the upper classes than anywhere else, and we see lots of that in royalty and nobility. But in that book that I told you, the PDF by Yolanda Anderley, she points out that about half of the women who were admitted to the Istituto delle Laste, which is the next thing I'm going to talk about, which was a maternity home for women and their illegitimate children in Trento in the 19th century, about half of the women there were young women engaged in, and this is where I'm going to tie it back to what I was talking about last week, they were engaged in domestic service. Okay, so these young women were unmarried and employed in other people's homes. Obviously, more wealthy people, because they're the ones who could afford to pay them. Almost half of the women admitted to the Institute were domestic servants. They weren't just women staying at home with their parents and having I mean, many of them were, but they weren't just having a fling with the boy next door. These were women who had become impregnated while in service to a wealthy employer. Now, we can't make up too much about this because we just don't know. Is it consensual? Was she having, oh, gee, you know, I'm being flattered by this handsome, wealthy guy? Or was it non-consensual? Was it rape? We actually don't know. We can only look at the statistics and start to wonder. But all we do know is that in the cases of these women, we don't know who their fathers were. And the reason for that is that it was a scandal. They were protected, you know, legally. So we don't know. So, and we'll come to that in a minute. So, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is that I've seen plenty of marriages in the villages, in the parishes, where a couple will marry days before their first child is born. I mean, like 2 days before their first child is born, or, you know, a month after. And it's really obvious that the couple had had a premarital affair and they got married. And that was usually the case. If it were a case of two young people, usually young people, having a fling, and they were both unmarried, well, those parents are going to make them get married, unless two things: unless there's a class distinction, or if one of them, usually the man, is already married. Oh, I shouldn't say usually the man, I'm assuming, so forget I said that, but I kind of get the impression it probably would be. But you see older women sometimes, widows, not widows, but yeah, I've seen a case, and I can't remember who it was now. There was a case of an older widow, older meaning 40, not 40, but in her 30s, mid 30s. So she's a young widow by today's standards, but not by then. And she had children with a man, illegitimate children that she never married, but they had lots of children. So it's like obviously a love affair. But that's not what I'm talking about here. These are situations where these are young women. The ages that I've seen them at usually vary between 18 and 23, thereabouts, and they are employed in domestic service. Okay, so what is this institute I'm talking about? It is a place called Istituto delle Laste. It is today on the site, it's the same place that is now in the place called the Santuario delle Laste, and it's on a hill, I can't remember which hill it is, on the north side of Trento. It's way up a steep hill. I've been there. It's a really fascinating place. It was used, I think, because it's close, the proximity, it's very convenient because it's near the city, but it's very peaceful there. It is up on top of a hill. You go there, you can hear the birds, you see the whole scene, the landscape. It's like a little retreat. I thought it was gorgeous when I was there. There are monks friars who still live there. It wasn't in operation for all that long. It was about, I think, 80 years. Yes, it opened in 1833. January of 1833, and it shut in November of 1870. So we're looking at about a 30, 40, 50, 60, up to, it was a 40-year period. Yes, sorry, not quite 40-year period, where this was not just a home for expectant unwed mothers. It was also a kind of orphanage, although I use the term loosely because I prefer to think of it as a maternity home. Anyway, Istituto delle Laste, as I said, established, it was opened in 1833, and it shut in November of 1870. At that point, they transferred all their offices up to Innsbruck. So Innsbruck then took over what was going on in Trento at this time. As I said, it's a beautiful place. You can visit there, but you'd have to call in advance. It's not like, one of my cousins kind of helped me, and he liaised, and I met with a priest there, or a friar, I should say. There were barefoot Carmelite friars who took me around and showed me old rooms. Now this place, it has a very interesting vibe to it. There's big sala materna. There's a sala. Can't remember all the names of the salas, but there's a room where the babies were delivered, which is just all windows on one side. It was very, very light, very light. There's a room where the children were kept, where they were nursed, and they would be with wet nurses once they were delivered from their mother. Now, and of course, there was an area where the women were cared for. Typically, the women would come in their last month of pregnancy or the last few weeks of pregnancy. She would deliver the baby, and then she would stay there. Now, here's the thing. It was free. It was one of the first instances of socialized, or government-supported medicine. It was a free service, but there was a catch. If it was free, they had there were a couple of stipulations. It was free and not free. If it was free, they couldn't remain anonymous in the books. I mean, they could go and remain anonymous when they went back home, because if the baby's left there and nobody knew about it, then scandal avoided. But they weren't anonymous in the books. Now, that was maybe difficult for them, but it's great for us, because as genealogists, we can find their information in the books, and the books still exist, and I'll tell you about those in a few minutes. So how much information is given? Again, it varies, and it depends on how much money they had. So money does talk in this situation. Wealthier women, or they didn't have to be wealthy, but at least enough who could pay for the services, could actually buy their anonymity. And I've had a few cases of that, and it's quite frustrating, because in those cases, researching the child is a dead end. It's not even like an adoption agency today, where it has the name of the parents somewhere that have to be unlocked for privacy issues. The mother's name just isn't there. Full stop. So, but the ones who were admitted free, there's usually at least some information about that woman, sometimes quite a lot of information, and sometimes not as much. The ones who were admitted free did have to pay, but not with money. What they did is they had to stay for up to, I think it was up to 2 months, but usually it wasn't that long. Usually it was just a few weeks, and do things like be a wet nurse for the babies. So they would be feeding lots of different babies, not just their own. In fact, they probably wanted to not encourage them to bond too much with their own children, I would imagine, but they were there to feed all the children. Also laundry, cleaning, all of those kinds of things. So they would basically do more domestic service while they were there as payment for the free medical services. Now, what was nice about this place for them is that, this is getting back to the midwives, this was not just a maternity home for unwed mothers. This was also an obstetrics school. This was a place where doctors and also midwives were being trained in modern obstetrics, in at least for that era. And it was clean. If you go there, it feels really clean. It's very, I don't know, to me it has a very light atmosphere. It's not like going to a workhouse in Britain, for instance. It's a different kind of place. Maybe because it was run by nuns at that point. It was very, very clean and tidy, and beautiful air and beautiful atmosphere, as I said. But anyway, the midwives were trained there in the most modern things to do with obstetrics, probably learning about the necessity for washing and things like that. It was a very cutting edge place. Nobody had ever heard of such a thing before in that area. So it was a really, really important place. Now, here's the thing. The records for this institution, even though it was moved to Innsbruck in 1871, the records for when it operated in the city of Trento still exist. There are these big ledgers, paper ledgers, and they are in the Archivio Provinciale in Trento, on the north side of Trento. I've seen them, I've looked through them. You can go there, you can leaf through them, you can photograph them. And if you're not so lucky to go there, you can also write to them. If you know somebody who was born there, you can write to them, give them the dates. and they will, or even a name, and they will they'll look it up and see if they can find that, and they will give you a photograph of it. They'll blank everything else out for purposes of confidentiality, but you can find out something if that ancestor is there. Now, what's important to remember is if you have an ancestor who was born, or a family member who was born in this institute, you will not find their names on the Nati in Trentino website. So if you've been struggling to find somebody and you think they may have been illegitimate and you can't find them on the Nati in Trentino website, this is why. Nati in Trentino website is only for children who were born and registered within the parishes. The Institute is not a parish. It's a civil organization. It's a completely different thing. They were baptized there. They had priests and nuns and whatever, but it wasn't the church. So those are not parish records. That's why they're not in Nati in Trentino, two separate things. However, the archivists in Trento have made a database of names. It's not online, but they can look it up. It's only accessible to the archivists, unfortunately. You have to write to them and give them what information you have. They'll try to find the child, and then they can find the record for you. There are different kinds of registers. One is a book of the entry, like when the mother came in, and if she is, it gives the mother a different classification, I think first, second, third class, and in this case, third class is the highest and not the lowest. And first means poverty, that they were admitted free, and that they have to kind of sing for their supper after the child is born, and also that they're not anonymous. The more that they can pay, the less you're going to know about the mother. They may just say mother brought in, and this is the name of the child. Now you're gonna. So wait, let me finish about the registers, and then I'll comment about the names. So there's the entrance, when the mother was admitted. Then there's a book of when the child was transferred. So in other words, taken out of the care of the birth mother and put into the maternity home. And then also the child's subsequent adoption. Wasn't really adoption, it was fostering. And I'll get to that in a second. I'll explain what I mean. Well, actually, I'll explain now. The children weren't actually full-time adoptees like nowadays. These children were still wards of the state until they were about 8 or 10. The age varied. It started at 10, and then because of money, it got lower and lower. What that meant was that the government, just as the same way they do now with foster children, the government paid a fee to the families to take care of the child. And also the child could be taken back. So in that way, it wasn't really adoption. That said, a lot of the children, or all the children I've researched so far, did stay with their adopted or foster parents. They stayed with them for various reasons. We can only deduce based on what we see, but technically they didn't always. And after a certain point, the government no longer gave any money, so then that child became no longer a ward of the state, but had to be supported by the parents. So what else did I say? Yes. So some of the information is going to be disappointing if the mothers could pay, and you find out nothing. Now, what do they do when a child is, when the mother is anonymous? Well, or a child is a foundling. Now, what they do, and this was something I was reading about in the Nati in Trentino, they would make up surnames, and this explains a lot about one of my clients who I believe the surname was made up because it's not a surname I've ever seen before. They'd make up names over all kinds of things. A lot of us have heard the name Esposito. It's actually Esposito, but in America they say Esposito. Now that is a euphemism for an illegitimate child. It means exposed, and I only just got the linguistic connection earlier this week. I was watching a show here in Britain called what's it called? Long Lost Family Born Without a Trace. And it's about foundlings in Britain. And in one English record written maybe 50, 60 years ago, it said child found exposed in a public place, blah, blah, blah. And then it suddenly hit me. This is what it means. Exposed means that the child is left out in the open in order to be found. So that's where the euphemism esposito comes from, esposti. All of these mean exposed children, so it means they were left. That's the name for foundlings. Now, esposito is not a name I've seen in Trentino, but you see it in other parts of Italy. So it means at some point in the past, one of their ancestors was a foundling. There is another name that was in Trentino that I hadn't heard before called trovatelli. Now, trovare means to find in Italian, trovare. So trovatelli means a child that was found or someone who was found. So trovatelli also indicates that this child was a foundling. Now, technically, these children who come to the Institute, if the mothers were there, they're not foundlings. They're orphans, or not even orphans. They're, again, they might be called orphans, but they're actually not. They're children who were given up. So they give them all kinds of different made-up names. If the mother is anonymous, they'll give them these names. If the mother is not anonymous, they will take the mother's maiden name, mother's surname. And I've seen both. And again, I'll give you a few examples right now. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of ancestor. I hope some of you don't mind. Hold on. Can see me great. So interesting. Thank you. I'm always very sensitive about sharing information about people's ancestry, but I know Loretta has talked about this ancestor publicly, so I'll mention it. So Loretta, with your permission. This is Loretta Shelton's, who is she now? Her great-grandmother or great-great-grandmother, I think. Her name was Paulina Fava. She was born at the Institute in 1869, right before it closed, a few months before it closed. Now, in that case, her mother was poor, and she was a domestic servant. Okay, it said both of those things. In the document that I got for her, and this was very encouraging, it doesn't give the father's name because they never do, or hardly ever do. There is one case where they did, and I'll tell you that one in a minute. In this case of Paulina, the mother is named, and the place where the mother came from. She came from Malay. So Fava is a name in Malay and in other places in that area. But here's where the interesting thing is. It didn't just give the mother's name. It gave the mother's age and the mother's parents. I know it gave the father. I think it may have given both the mother and father. I can't remember now, but I know it gave at least the father. What that did is it enabled me, even though Paulina herself was illegitimate and was adopted by a completely different family with a completely different surname in a completely different part of the province, and we know about that family too, and that's the family actually Loretta knew. We were able, or I was able to trace Paulina's ancestry back to the 1500s because the Malay records are brilliant. Okay, so that was very exciting. So that was a success case, even if we don't know who the father is. And also it was a very endearing case because the couple who adopted her had just lost their first and only child, and then a year later the husband died. And it's a really, really deep story. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but you can see, you can feel almost the grief there was poignant. And they went to find a child to replace this baby who died in actually had quite a deformity, had a spinal deformity, and died pretty much within 2 days. And they adopted Paulina, and they buried their baby on the same afternoon. When I read that story, when I pieced that story together, it actually gave me chills. Now, another woman I met, her name was Francesca Annesi. Now, she was born at the Institute in 1845. Now, she's an ancestor of somebody in this group, Barbara Deltzer. Her mother's name and the mother's village are given, but not the parents. And that's really unfortunate because it says that she was from Meano and her mother's name was Domenica, and that name Annesi is common in that area around Trento, but I can't find any mother born exactly at that time in that particular village, but some of the peripheral villages, yeah. And without a father's name, Again, I'm at a dead end because I can't figure out who that is, and it appears certainly nowhere else later. So a bit disappointing. However, what was very interesting is this. Francesca's adoptive parents ended up being, well, let me put it this way. Francesca's adoptive parents, they were Andreatta in Seguenzano. And Francesca grew up to marry one of their sons. How about that? Now, I think that's interesting. Just to see that, to look at the record and see that Francesca's adoptive parents became her parents-in-law. So it was like the people she always knew as her parents were always her parents in that way. So even if they were not related to her by blood, it certainly is a very interesting, again, an interesting family story. Why did they take her in? Well, I looked at their tree. They had no daughters. They had lots and lots of sons. And maybe that's why, maybe they just wanted a daughter. I don't know. All I know is that they took her in, and she grew up to marry one of their sons, which I think is very cool. Now, interestingly, Barbara, same client, has another ancestor born at the Institute. Now, her name was Josefa Carolina Domini, okay? And now Domini is a made-up surname. Made up. It basically means of God or gift of God. And she was born in 1839, so early on in the years of the Institute. And her mother was wealthier. There is zero information about the mother, nothing. I'm hoping at some point I might be able to go in and see if there's anything at all anywhere, but she basically bought her anonymity. So in this case, you've got a child who has a made-up surname that doesn't exist, and that was it. Again, we found out who she was raised by, and that's the family that everybody knew, but we can't assume that there was any biological relationship at all. Now I'm going to mention Sloane's family. They had a child. This was an interesting case because they also had a child who was born in, this is a Giacomuzzi family. I can't remember if it was the Giacomuzzis or one of the other lines. They also had a child who was born there. But in this case, I have a feeling the parents of the woman were forcing the daughter to give up the child, but she didn't want to, obviously, because the child was born in the Institute. I don't remember the name of the child. I haven't looked it up, and I can't remember. But the child it was a boy. The child was born in the Institute. The mother went home, and the parents got married, like within 2 months, and raced back and got that child out of the orphanage and took him home and raised him. So that to me was, oh God, I could try to imagine this kind of 2 months panic that she was having. It was probably a squabble between the families not wanting the kids to get married, a little bit of Romeo and Juliet or something, who knows, I don't know. But they did get married and that child came home. So that was a completely different story. So now two stories I want to talk about, oh gosh, this is going on. As usual, I'm talking much longer than I thought I would. Two quick stories about my own illegitimacy, my own tree, that have zero to do with the Institute, okay? One was way back in 1624. 1624, my 8 times great-grandmother, her name was Margherita Malacarne, and I've mentioned her sometimes on different posts in the group. She's actually the ancestor of every single Serafini in this group and lots of other lines as well. She was my 8 times great-grandmother on every single line, every single Trentino line I have, all right? Every single branch from 3 of my grandparents, okay? Or great-grandparents. One of them is from Verona, but from the ones who are from Trentino. Now, when I found her baptismal record, I thought it said that she was daughter of Mario, and that the priest had left out the mother's name. I thought that was odd because Mario wasn't the kind of name they used in 1624, at least not in Bleccia, and I thought it was really strange. And for a long time I thought that until I started finding other documents about her. Then I realized that actually it said that she was the daughter of Maria. And it says it on her marriage record, and it says it on her baptismal record. But what it doesn't say is that she was illegitimate. Obviously she was, because there's no father mentioned. And I've pretty much tracked down who Maria has to be, because there is only one Maria of childbearing age born within a certain period. I find that really interesting. Now, did she have any of the stigmas attached to it? I doubt it, because she married, she had like 9 kids. And then when she was widowed, she remarried, and she actually remarried another one of my ancestors. And so she's a huge person in my tree. It doesn't even say she was illegitimate in the record. All it does is that it omits a father's name. And it took me a while to realize that that's what it said. So you have to read and read and read and really carefully reread. 2 examples from the 20th century. My grandfather's elder sister, Margarita, was born illegitimate. Okay, she's but because her parents married after the fact, she was later legitimized, as I gave the example before. What's interesting about that is in the parish records, it gives her surname at birth as my great-grandmother's surname, my great-grandmother's maiden name, which is Parisi. And then later, after she was legitimized, and there's a little note that says, born illegitimate, but legitimized when her parents married on this date. That's what it says under the record. And then the priest sticks in my grandfather's surname, my great-grandfather's surname. So in Annati and Trentino, this child is registered as Serafini's surname and name Margherita Parisi. So as if Parisi is her middle name. It wasn't. It was her original surname, which again I find interesting. Now what's interesting also about this family is his younger sister, Palma. She had an illegitimate child in World War I with an Austrian soldier, and I have a feeling a lot of this happened. And so that family went on to have lots of children, and not the couple, but the child grew up to have lots of children, and they're all my cousins now. I believe Palma was a very strong early 20th century woman who really just didn't care. And she dealt with all of the whatever. She raised her son to be proud, and all of her children are immensely successful. So it's like the stigma, I think, changes, and certainly has changed nowadays. Anyway, that's my story. And I hope that gave you some good information about certain ideas about, thank you, Susan, about legitimacy, and also Istituto delle Laste in Trento. If you think you have had an ancestor who may have been born there, remember the years is 1633 to 1870, the end of 1870, November 1870. After that, there were some in Innsbruck. Those documents are not in Trento. I imagine they're in Innsbruck. Some of you also had information about other institutes in other parts of the empire. I think it's a fascinating part of history. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm going to be back in 2 weeks. I'll be doing this now from now on first and third Fridays of every month, first and third Fridays. And next time I'll be looking at some family spotlights. I'm going to choose probably about 2 or 3 families and looking at their overall history, getting into the kind of juicy history. I want to look at families who may have migrated from other places, because I think that's kind of interesting. So anyway, that's what I'll be doing next time, and I'll see you in the group, but I'll see you in 2 weeks on Philo Friday. Bye-bye.